Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Businessology Show. You know, we love to have great guests that are going to challenge how we think and the things that we do in creative entrepreneurship to try to make better decisions, more rational decisions, not be so arbitrary and thereby wreck a lot of the work we're trying to do for our clients. And so I have somebody that has done huge amounts of research on that. And so I'm thankful to have Dave Snowden. He is joining us on the show today, and I'm just going to read his bio. So he's the founder and chief scientific officer of the Entangling Company, and his work is international in nature, covers government, industry, looking at complex issues related to strategy, organizational decision making, and he's pioneered a science-based approach to organizations, certainly drawn on anthropology, neuroscience, complex adaptive systems theory. So Dave could go as deep as we want to go, but I asked him to stay pretty high level. So Dave, thanks so much for being on the Businessology Show. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, okay. So Dave, one thing I really want to dive into, and I hope this leads us to some other great conversation, but what is the Cynefin framework that you created a long time ago? And just tell us briefly what this audience can leverage and use out of that framework.
You know, we celebrated its 21st anniversary last year.
Congrats.
So it's been around. I think one of the strengths of Cynefin is that it's changed over time. So we've had new theory and new practice coming together. But in its simplest form, this is what we call the 3+1 version of Cynefin.
Okay.
It talks about three different types of system: ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. Mm-hmm. So I'll define those. All right. So an ordered system is one with such a high level of constraint or structure that behavior is predictable and you can have good practice, best practice, whatever. There is a right way of doing things. In a complex, the best definition I've seen of complex is Alicia Geraro's famous phrase, like bramble bushes in a thicket. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a complex system. Everything is entangled with everything else. And although you know there's some structure in there, you can't discover it. And if you ever tried to walk through bramble bushes in a thicket, you know that if you pull something effs snaps and hits you on the back. So the essence of a complex adaptive system is everything is entangled with everything else. So effectively an ordered system is contained. Okay. A complex system is connected. And as a result of which there isn't any linear causality. The same thing only happens again the same way twice by accident. Yeah.
Yep.
And then in a chaotic system, this is where there are radical differences between different bodies of theory. So everybody has to define what they mean. Okay. I mean a system without effective constraints. So that's sort of pseudo-random. And those systems are only ever temporary in human systems. So if you want a symbol for this, it's solid, liquid, and gas. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So and you remember that introduced the concept of a phase shift. If you heat water up to 100 degrees, it doesn't immediately become steam. You have to put more heat in. It always warms up a little bit before it snows because energy has to be thrown out. So order, complex, and chaos go through that phase shift, with an energy gradient. Yeah. And again, to finish the metaphor, there's a thing, if you go back to your high school physics, all right, or chemistry, called the triple point. Which is a balance of pressure and temperature, where it's equiprobable whether something can become solid, liquid, or gas. Now, in Cynefin, that's the central domain, which is called the aporetic domain. And that's probably a new word for people.
Yeah, for sure.
It comes from the Greek. Basically, famous commentator from Derrida, he said, if you know the answer to a question, it isn't a question, it's a process.
I love that.
So aporia are questions which can't be answered without thinking differently. And we actually have a whole body of methods to do this, both physical, linguistic, and aesthetic, which we'll give you the links for. And that central domain of Cynefin is critical because you move things into that domain, you ask questions that can't immediately be answered, and then you move things into the other three, depending on where you are. So fundamentally, Cynefin says there isn't a single unified context-free way of making decisions. In order, complex, and chaos, you make decisions in very different ways.
Okay. So what I'm getting from a lot of that is the linear causality between causation, and in entrepreneurship, of course, that really does matter, because we have to know, what am I going to do to cause the next thing? And the Cynefin framework is giving us an ability to say some things have that linear causality, some don't. And we feel that in entrepreneurship because we often don't know what to do. And there are even parts to the framework where you can't possibly know what to do. Like, did I describe that right from maybe an entrepreneurial perspective?
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. And I mean, sometimes I often make a reference to what I call the Frozen 2 approach. So if you haven't watched Frozen 2, you can now go watch it, all right? I mean, Frozen 1 is a fairly stereotypical movie, but Frozen 2, they made enough money on the first franchise, the script writers could do a good job on the second one.
Well, I didn't know that.
There's a moment in Frozen 2 where the real heroine of the Frozen series, who's the younger sister without the magic, is in a state of despair where she thinks the snowman and the older sister are dead and she's got to do everything for herself.
Right.
And this beautiful song, she says, all I can do is do the next right thing and look again. And that's the key complexity message. In complexity, it's called the adjacent possible, if we go to Kaufman. So the big thing in complexity that we focus on is mapping. We don't talk about what the future state should be and try and close the gap. That's systems thinking. We say, what's the present state and what are the next steps we can take, and look again. So we start a journey with a sense of direction. And I've done 3 software startups in my life, right? You don't want to be precise about where you're going. You want a good sense of direction to give you focus, but you want to be open to novelty as you go through the process of discovery, and co-production with clients and so on. So that's a key message from complexity.
Okay. Well, so how does that match, a technologist who builds, an MVP, which they think it's going to work, and they've convinced a venture capitalist, so they get money. Would you say you can't, even at the time you receive maybe that angel funding or whatever, you can't possibly know even what that MVP is going to become, so you've gotten funded too early, or how would
you've got too much funding? I've done 3 software startups, all right, and 2 in the company, 1 for myself. We're now at 18 years on SenseMaker, which is our software product. We've never had any investment.
Okay.
All the money has come from selling features to clients. And my view is, and we're doing something completely novel, by the way. So we're creating a market. We're not just, we're not just building something from a market.
Yeah.
We're now looking for venture capital because now we can scale. So we've created the market, now we can scale. And I have an old rule on software, for example, if you can't sell it to a client, you probably shouldn't develop it. And the pressure of selling it to a client and the client requirements going backwards and forwards, you can't just indulge yourself with the VC money and build the better mousetrap. You actually have to go and work with people whose job is to catch mice.
Yeah. Okay. So even as you're describing that, and we're thinking about this framework about complexity, you're not saying VC money is wrong. You're saying it can be wrong at certain stages of building an entrepreneurial company. And you're saying the market,
you should be underfunded, for example, right?
Yeah.
So put angel money in enough to get your core team and build your prototypes and your brochure and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then go and bloody well sell the stuff is kind of like the lesson.
Yeah. Because the lesson is the market will teach you what you should build for the market.
Got it. So when, for example, the first big thing I did was a sort of stock forecasting and logistics package. So we worked with a university. And up to that time, people used the 2-bin method for stock replacement. I do that. I've got 2 wine fridges in the garage. All right. So when one's empty, I know it's time to reorder. And our first clients were actually Coca-Cola, Schweppes, and British Aerospace. So we had, so we had the basic concept that the exciting idea was variable buffer stock based on forecast accuracy. Now that's how everybody does it now, but we did it first. Yeah. And then you meet real clients and you meet early adopters. Well, Coca-Cola and Schweppes is FMCG, fast-moving, daren't be out of stock. We had to do a deal with the British Met Office to bring weather forecasting into the buffer stock calculations. British Aerospace, we had to create whole new statistical methods for what's called lumpy. So something wouldn't be in demand for 3 years, and all of a sudden they'd need 500, and each of them cost a fortune. So as you meet reality, provided you're not overstructured, you can then flex it. Yeah, and the nice thing about early adopters is when you sell to them, they're nearly always multi-industry. There's 2.5% of the market that will always buy something new, and you can find them in all different industries, and actually finding those people and selling is key. So in those early stages, you sell features, you don't develop industry-specific stuff. When you get industrial specific, the market's entering maturity.
Man, that is wild. So why is it related to all that? Why is it important to understand the decisions we're making as entrepreneurs are simple, complicated, complex, or chaotic? Why do we have to know what part of the framework we're in?
Right. So if I take ordering in Cynefin splits into two. One is called clear, the other is complicated. So in clear, everybody can see the relationship between cause and effect, and nobody challenges it. So that's where we do best practice.
Right. Okay.
Yeah? And best practice is always past practice, but there's nothing wrong with past practice if you're in a repeating situation. Yeah.
Right.
We talk about good practice in the complicated domain, which is where if you've got the right expertise, you can make decisions. So let's take an example. If you're building software, and this is where I've got all my experience. Yeah. These days, GDPR requirements are massive, and you need to architect for that really early on. Well, that's expert knowledge. That's ordered. You have to buy it in, and you have to conform. But where you're looking at features, that's where you move into the complex domain. And the essence of the complex domain is you will always have different and competing coherent hypotheses about what you should do. So if it's complex, you don't try and resolve which is right or which is wrong, or for God's sake, let the founder decide. That's always a mistake, and I speak as a founder. You construct a safe-to-fail experiment around each coherent hypothesis, and you run them in parallel, and you see what happens. Yeah? And what actually happens is things mutate and change. But they're safe to fail in terms of economic cost and ability to recover. And I think that's the key principle in complexity. It's constant experimentation, but not just with anything, but only with what we call coherent ideas. There has to be some evidence to support them.
Okay, that was a terminology I focused in on when studying some of your stuff. Is the safe to fail experiment in certain parts of places we get, you don't try to fully build something, you actually start testing. Safe to fail is more of a testing. Is it an A/B test? Is that kind of how you would describe it?
No, that's more complicated, all right? Okay. So safe to fail experiments, or we call them probes rather than experiments, because they may all fail. And that's good news. It's like in military terms, you send out 50 patrols and see who comes back alive, and that tells you where the enemy is, isn't it? Right? So probes are important, but the key principle is they run in parallel, not in sequence.
Okay.
All right. And that's vital, because then you don't get what's called the Hawthorne effect. So if you do something novel for the first time, it will nearly always work, and you'll get confirmation bias. By forcing parallelism, we remove that danger.
Okay. That makes sense. Now, how does doing experiments inside of the world we now live in, social platforms where we can get a lot of social feedback that may or may not be wrong, and does it drive a lot of wrong thinking and wrong innovation, wrong building?
Yeah.
Or is that market something to rely on?
I mean, we have a method we use in social change as well as technology development called Entangling Trios. Yeah. And so, for example, in software development, we put a systems architect together with a young programmer, together with a user trained to talk to IT people. Right. And that creates a threesome. We'll then throw 15 threesomes at a problem for 4 or 5 weeks and see what they come up with as an alternative to traditional requirement scanning. So what we're introducing is cognitive and experiential diversity into a human sensor network working in multiple parallelism. And what comes out of that then actually is going to be more sustainable.
That reminds me of, like, my partner always says to me that I'm truly the entrepreneurial type person and have been for decades. She says she's not, and she always has the perspective of a client, whereas I have the perspective of the entrepreneurial owner. And so she sees things often in different ways than I do, and it does make our decisions stronger because we have different perspectives. Is that similar to what you're talking about, having you put these groups together?
We're formalizing it. Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the things we've done, for example, in social change, and social entrepreneurship is a big field, you put teenager together with somebody from their grandparents' generation, together with somebody in government who can make the idea work. 20 of those working on a social problem can get results far faster, and that's a complexity technique.
Okay. That's safe to fail experiments is what that is.
Yeah.
Okay. I love that.
And these days in Kinevin, I always put 2 bars in front. It's parallel. Yeah.
Okay. So they always go together. Okay. That makes sense. So I want to read you something from a Harvard Business Review article you wrote like way back in 2007. So, I mean, you've been writing about this forever. And it says there's a fundamental assumption of organizational theory and practice, which is a lot of what we focus on in the structuring of teams for our entrepreneurs, that a certain level of predictability and order exists in the world. And this assumption, grounded in the Newtonian science that underlines scientific management, encourages simplification that are useful in ordered circumstances. And so it starts to make me think that Daniel Kahneman's talking about using heuristics to make our decisions actually is not the best way to do it when you get into more complex situations. And I think that's what that quote was referring to. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, these days I've modified it a bit because I actually think scientific management was a lot more open to complexity. I think I was more talking about systems dynamics there. Yeah.
Okay.
The sort of business process re-engineering, Six Sigma.
Yeah.
All those sort of approaches.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it's kind of like a false predictability. And if you look at Porter, for example, Porter is the archpriest of strategy in the systems thinking era.
Michael Porter.
And it's the 5 forces and predictability. Right. If you look at strategy with Peter Drucker, and I had the privilege to teach with him, right?
Nice.
There was high levels of ambiguity. You didn't have 3 and 5 year plans. It was much more about what do we do now, and much more about instinct. So if we go to Kahneman, and Kahneman is interesting because we knew about what he discovered in cognitive neuroscience years before he did that research. It's called autonomic novelty receptive processing, which is actually a better way of thinking about things. So a huge amount of the decisions you make are actually autonomic. Your body is making the decision.
Right.
Your brain fires after the event, simply to double check that it got it right, because you can't afford the energy of novelty receptive processing all the time.
Right.
So one of the key things to understand in product development is you have to introduce enough cognitive load that people are forced into novelty receptive processing. Because if you don't have massive cognitive load, they'll just go with the flow.
Right. That is.
I'll give you an illustration on the famous experiment which was run. So they gave radiologists a batch of X-rays and asked them to look for anomalies. And on the final X-ray, they put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. Now, on average, 83% of radiologists will not see the gorilla. And the 70% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. It's called inattentional blindness. So we do not see what we do not expect to see. Right. Now, one of the things about entrepreneurs, and I've been one, is we tend to be in the 17%, and we're stubborn enough that we go with it. Right? Now, again, one of the things we work on, for example, we use whole of workforce engagement or mass sensors, mass human sensors, not AI, to map everybody interprets a situation, and then we look at landscape maps of that to find the outliers. And again, this is a key thing entrepreneurs need to be doing marketing. You need to be finding the outliers in your customer base, not the people in the center, because the people in the center will buy existing products.
Mm. So you're saying the outliers are the ones that will put up with your innovations or the selling of a new thing they don't yet understand.
Yeah. And the real problem is that they'll actually, I mean, I've been here, right? They'll come along and say, oh, this is wonderful. I've been telling people this for ages. Thank God you caught up with me. And you have to breathe a sigh and just go with it for a bit, all right? I mean, I remember we did the logistics stuff when we were working with NATO, on spare parts. And I mean, they wanted to get involved in the algorithm design. They were so excited that somebody was finally doing something that they thought about for a bit. And it was a pain, all right? And the big thing that people don't realize is in that early adopter phase, that sort of 2.5% of the total market, you're dealing with enthusiasts. You're dealing with the guys who think the purpose of a car is for them to take it apart every weekend and rebuild the engine.
Right.
Yeah. And that's it. And then the market switches. This is going back to Moore's crossing the chasm.
This is good stuff, Dave, and it's making me think a lot of what it sounds like you're saying is a lot of our best benefits as entrepreneurs is going to be in a lot of more short-term thinking, which is what to do next in the middle of a complex place, how to innovate like with your next step, because you can't plan the 3 to 5 year strategic plan out. Especially around complex things like technology builds and things like that. Is it short term you're talking about? Be more short term in how you think through your work?
I think it's a mixture. There's a phrase we use in complexity a lot, is there's no such thing as a context-free solution. Everything is context-specific.
Okay.
So, for example, when I was in charge of strategy in data centers, we needed to introduce complete novelty around RAD-JAD. It was early stage agile. Yeah. What we did is we made it a symbiotic feature of legacy system management, because selling it up front was too hard. That's called a symbiotic strategy. So we made it a differentiator. Within 2 years, it was most of the sales. Yeah. On the other hand, what I've been doing with SenseMaker is nobody had even thought about distributed ethnography till I did the DARPA work on that. So actually, we're creating a market which we can serve with a product, and that's very different again. Right? That's more thought leadership based, and it's a very different approach. So you need to understand: am I creating a market? Am I creating products for the market? Is it service? Do people know what they want? All right, or do they not know what they want? And if you look at Apple's great success, Apple never, ever developed anything that anybody had asked for.
Yeah.
They developed things that people didn't know they wanted till they had them, and they couldn't do without them. And that's actually a good position.
Yeah. But it's hard to create your own market. I mean, right?
It isn't. There's big gaps out there. Remember, go back to what I talked about, people not finding the gorilla, right?
Yeah.
That means there's a huge amount out there which nobody's seeing. So go for it.
Yeah. Well, and I guess it reminds me of a question Peter Thiel asks in his book. He says, what amazing company is nobody building yet? So he's trying to ask, what is not being built that actually needs to be built? And that's kind of a market building perspective, I guess, on entrepreneurship.
I think his criticism of Facebook was actually very good, right? And I think that's the principle, all right? It's if you want to be an entrepreneur, you've got to believe in things, and you've got to be prepared to survive. All right. I mean, you've got to be bloody stubborn.
Yes.
All right. Because people, I mean, there's a Mullah Nasruddin story on that. If you don't know it, Mullah Nasruddin in Sufi philosophy, you only teach by storytelling. You're not allowed to argue logically.
Okay.
So there's a story about the Mullah Nasruddin. All right. And he's never seen a falcon before. He lives in a city, so he's only ever seen pigeons. One day a falcon lands on his windowsill, and he looks at it and he says, "You poor bird." And he clips its talons and clips its beak and clips its wings so it looks like a pigeon. And he said, "There you are, now you're a real bird." And I remember every time anybody in IBM said, "Can't you make this easier?" I used to put that story up and say, "Please stop making my falcons into pigeons."
That's a great phrase. I'm going to start using that. So Dave, this is a great discussion on complexity, and I know it can go in a lot of different ways. I appreciate you hemming it in for entrepreneurs to help us understand. One thing that we have had to learn to do when we consult with service-based entrepreneurs, which is our work, is that the pace and cadence of the revenue as it picks up, that is, as scaling starts to really shoot up, the maturing of their systems, their team structures, their processes and things like that don't often mature at the same pace. And so they love the spike in their revenue, but they don't often manage that and pull it back so that their team and systems and training and processes can catch up and support what they built. So what we do is, so how do we help them build teams and structures that stay with the cadence of the pace of their revenue that's shooting up into the cloud?
Some of it is, there's another framework called Flexure's Curves, which combines Moore's crossing the chasm with life cycle stuff, which is available on the website.
Okay.
And I think part of it is people consciously thinking, where am I on that curve? Right? Because you've got to change behavior. So we're going through a pivot within Cognitive Edge at the moment on our software. So we're going from projects to product.
Okay, yeah.
Right? Now, that's actually really difficult for people who spent the last 4 or 5 years in a project mentality.
Yeah.
And we've now created enough mature market, enough experience. We don't need to go through that design stage. We can just give people things we know work. So one of the things you've got to work on is, when do you bring in new staff? And when do you bring in staff with different backgrounds?
Right.
And when do you create variety within that? And how do you secure the core business? What's the balance between service and product? In the service industry, one of the really big things is, how do you get non-utilization revenue? Because as long as you're in a utilization position, you're stymied for growth.
Okay.
So there are standard questions you can ask and standard positions you can look.
Okay.
And a lot of it is just, it's what Bateson famously called the differences that make a difference.
Yeah.
I've created three major frameworks in my life, all right? All of them are designed to be drawn on the back of a table napkin from memory.
Yeah.
And that's key to a sense-making framework, because you need to be able to draw it with your team and say, okay, we're here, so we do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and the Cynefin framework is a simple 4-quadrant model, though it's very complex.
Not a 4-quadrant model. No. Sorry, it's definitely not a 4-quadrant model.
Okay.
It's got 5 domains and 6 liminal areas. You can't have 5 quadrants. Mathematically, it's impossible. The central domain on Cynefin is key.
Okay, well then explain that, because when you visually look at it, you see 4. Tell me what we need to see when we look at it.
If you actually look at it, you'll see it's... Actually, have a look at the Cynefin framework. You'll see the central domain is there.
Is disorder in the middle, right?
Well, that's an older version. We now call that apparetic.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
Or sometimes confused, all right? So the one level, you've got sort of clear, complicated, complex, chaotic, confused.
Okay.
Or ordered, complex, chaotic, apparatic, right?
Okay.
But the central domain is really important on Cynefin.
Okay. Say that again. Tell me why. Explain that central domain.
Well, remember I talked about the triple point?
Yep.
Yeah. That's that domain. So it's the point at which you could move in any direction. If you look at, for example, the European Union Field Guide on Managing Complexity in a Crisis, which I was a principal author on, it talks about the apparatic turn. So it says, in a real crisis, and if you're an entrepreneur, you'll be in crises.
Yeah.
Most of the time, you don't make decisions. You coordinate other people making decisions. Unless you're in a major crisis, at which point you make decisions decisively to increase the number of options open. So that's a shift into apparatic. And then from apparatic, some of the problems will be ordered, some will be complex, some you need to use chaos to resolve. So you move there, then you move out.
Okay, I never thought about it that way.
Remember, I'll give you a list. We created linguistic aporia, things like paradoxes.
Yeah.
Physical aporia, which is putting people in positions where they just can't do the way they did it before. And also aesthetics. We do a lot of work with semiotics and cartoons because people have to think differently if you put them into a different environment.
Okay.
And all of those are type of apparatic interventions.
Okay. And so that leads me back to that other question, which is when you're helping somebody from a consultative perspective build a team or, human organizational theory, there are times when you put some of those teams in places they don't know how to operate to help them grow. There are times you keep them in a best practice location to fulfill a revenue generation on a more regular basis, right? Okay. And so
there are techniques. There are techniques like Entangling Trios. So the way we handle cross-silo work is by entangling trios across the silos. We don't try and break down the silos because silos are needed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you don't have silos, knowledge gets too difficult to use and store and share. You need to share it within professional groups. So what we do in and we've got another method called the triopticon, which brings 3 to 5 different disciplines together over an orchestrated dance over 2 days and generates novel ideas from those approaches. So there are processes you can apply here. It's not just a sort of hope to God to do it. Yeah, the way you manage complexity is by processes designed for complexity, not for order.
I see. Okay. So there are processes designed for order, things that are predictable. There are processes that you've developed that are for things that you don't understand and don't have order.
Yeah.
Okay. That is amazing.
So Entangled Trios is one. That's a classic. We have the sort of unarticulated need mapping.
Mm-hmm. What is that?
We have the whole issue about how do you match existing capability against those unarticulated needs. So there are processes and tools which have been designed. Our whole raison d'etre as a company is we don't replicate what works for order. We identify the boundaries between order and complexity. Then we develop methods and tools to handle complexity.
Okay. Man, that is amazing. Where do you most see people applying this thought? Is it entrepreneurship? Is it government? Or is it's everywhere?
It varies. So, military is very strong. Military got it early on. So you don't get to command level in any of the US Armed Forces without learning Knevin.
Okay.
Right? It's used in the development sector. If you go and do a search on Google Scholar, you'll see it used for risk, for strategy, for everything.
Okay.
So there's no particular domain or use. And the thing I'm actually quite proud of, to be honest, I think about 98% of the uses of Knevin we haven't been involved in.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that is amazing. People, have they adapted it to their own situations? Is that what they're doing, or?
No, it's quite good. People, you get people who call it, who talk about the 5 quadrants of Knevin, and we smile when they do that. All right. You get people. There's a guy he's created a version he calls Codevin, and that's kind of like okay because he acknowledges the original. All right.
Yeah. Right.
But most people just use it as it is because it's. And every 1st of March, I normally write 3 to 5 blog posts and update the framework. So it's gone through a lot of change over the last 20 odd years.
Yeah. Well, and even that is amazing. We've developed a growth framework that has to change, and the first time we did it, we think, wow, we've figured this out. and then you roll it out into a conference, you have people do exercises and you go, we haven't figured this out at all. We didn't even think about the questions people are asking. So it's wild. You've developed such a stable, strong framework for so long, and yet you have to update it every single year. How did you know to do that?
I think I'm a tinkerer.
Okay, you want to just play with it.
And it's also what we call praxis. So I read a lot. And I do a lot of work with clients. So an awful lot of the methods we've done have me been applying theory and client work. So the key thing we do as a company is we say we use natural science as a constraint. So we say we know like the gorilla, right? The 70%. we know we can't train people to see that gorilla, right? So we need to develop tools which assume that we won't. And that's a very different approach from what most people say, oh, this is bad. How do we stop people doing it? We say, actually, it's probably not bad. It's got evolutionary purpose. I mean, Klein says there's no such thing as a cognitive bias. They all have utility.
Wow.
So once we know what they are, we design systems based around using it rather than trying to stop it.
Okay. So as Daniel Kahneman talks about cognitive bias, we don't go, well, that's bad. We go, no, that's the way we're made. How do we deal with it, and how is it going to help us do our work better? Like, is that a better approach to it?
The way we evolved. Sorry, I'm a good Catholic, but I'm trying to avoid young Earth creationism.
Okay.
So yeah, one of the arguments is that so-called cognitive bias have evolved to reduce the energy cost of decision making for us as a collective species.
Which is good.
So we evolved as a collective species, not as an individual. And if you look at the cognitive biases overall, well, I mean, the way I normally illustrate it, all right, if you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, and something large and yellow with sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed, do you want to artistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look up best practice case studies on how to deal with lions? By that time, the only document of any use will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a survivor. So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan privileged on our most recent experience.
Yeah,
that's how people make decisions. Right. So now you build systems based on that.
Well, and also in the cognitive bias, I guess, built into our amygdala is what's going to make us run from that carnivore, right? And so, but it's not always accurate, right? Our amygdala doesn't always lead us in the way that we need to go.
But overall, it works.
Yeah, well, it does.
Species, right?
Right. It does work. Here we are, right? So, well, okay. So this is all good stuff. Let me ask you some more general questions just about entrepreneurship as we're kind of wrapping up here. So I really enjoyed Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1. And he says, really in the first introduction, today's best practices lead to dead ends. The best paths are new and untried. Is that true? Is that always true? Or is that a generalization?
I know what he's saying, and I agree. It's like one of the worst books I've ever read is Lean Startup. Right?
Why? Why? People love that book.
I know they do, because he creates a recipe based on interviewing people who succeeded. When I was in IBM, we did the same project with Dorothy Leonard at Harvard, and we interviewed people who failed, and they did all those things as well. Yeah, so the point is you've got to market, so some people are bound to succeed. You haven't got a simple formula to follow. And I think the trouble is, if you take Lean Startup seriously, on your third pivot you'll succeed. Now, this is nonsense, right?
Right, for sure.
So there is a whole bunch of stuff which is best practice. If you're an entrepreneur, you need somebody to look after the finance who's pragmatic.
Right.
Yeah, you need to comply with GDPR. There are a whole bunch of best practices you need to do.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the ordered domain. In the complex domain, they're to be avoided like the plague.
Okay.
All right. At that point, you're talking about emergent practice.
But you would say in the complex domain, that's where innovations can exist and come out of. So we do want, and I guess what you're saying is you have built processes to deal with the fact that you can't know or don't know currently.
So we've actually got good practice processes, but they're designed to produce unanticipatable outcomes.
Okay. SafetyFailed Experiments are going to be an example.
One of the projects we did, all right, we took narratives about people's gardens, all right? This was working with a big European company. And then we got all the experts in the lighting company to interpret their technologies. This is using high abstraction metadata, which is one of the things we invented and created the patents in. Then we threw those two databases together at a metadata level, and we got 5 clusters that we presented to marketing, and 3 of them became major businesses, including repurposing an electrical circuit designed to handle urine-saturated staircases in a football ground is now used as part of an ornamental rock feature in people's ponds. Yeah? Now, if you look at it, that's a process designed to throw things together at a level of abstraction.
Yeah.
to suggest things to people that they might otherwise think of. So there are things you can do to create some structure and order in complexity.
Okay. So how can entrepreneurs, like maybe what's the first thing they can do to start moving into a place of noticing patterns, to apply those to make better decisions? What are some of the first things? If there's an entrepreneur who's just not good at what they do, they're pretty abstract. They're driven by their emotion. How do they need to structure themselves through some of this work?
Balance the team. I mean, you need to be careful on this, but I've always ended up with people working with me who are what Belbin used to call completer finishers. Yeah. So I can do the monitor evaluation and the ideation. So you need to have teams where skills and cognitive biases and cultural things complement each other. And you shouldn't be afraid of a bit of conflict in that. In fact, building conflict into the system is a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. That's amazing. Well, would you categorize entrepreneurship to say, hey, it should become more methodical or slower, or are those the wrong descriptors?
Well, first of all, I would always make a difference between entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship.
Okay, what's the difference between those?
A lot of people have been intrapreneurs. They're innovating within a big company, and I've done that as well. Right, okay. So I understand that's different, right? In entrepreneurship, there are things that there are good practices and there are methods to follow, which can reduce the uncertainty. You don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. Yeah. What you shouldn't do is take a recipe. Another metaphor here, we talk about the difference between a chef and a recipe book user.
Yeah.
So a recipe book user follows a formula, and that's what Lean Startup is, all right? So it's for recipe users. Entrepreneurs are chefs, but they need to know enough about the theory of cooking, and they need to have understood an apprenticeship so that they're not constantly reinventing. Yeah. So what can be reused gets reused. But it gets used at the right level of granularity and in the right combinations.
Okay. That switch is what seems to make sense is if you're a true entrepreneurship, if you're a person that is an entrepreneur and you're always creating new things, you do need to know when to switch those over to a pattern-based model that other people can follow and continue to operate while you continue to innovate. You're balancing your team.
And I think that's the point, all right? I mean, if you look at Silicon Valley, which is one of my favorite TV things, yeah? You've got the entrepreneur, but you've got the finance guy who does the HR and everything else.
Right.
And you also need to think about, I've got a good friend in England. He's a serial entrepreneur. The minute his company hits 15, he sells it. Because he doesn't want to have to manage more than 15 people.
Yeah. Well, that's about this. Go ahead.
If you want a farming metaphor, and I come from a farming background, all right? Yeah. There's a whole bunch of farmers who just make their money of raising calves and hand them over to somebody else to fatten them up. And that's actually not a bad idea sometimes for entrepreneurs to think about it that way.
Okay. Yeah. Because ultimately what you're saying is entrepreneurs, if they do build a successful business, it's always going to go through different stages and life cycles, and you may be good at one and not good at the other one.
Got it.
And so it's best to learn what you're good at and stop doing what you're not good at, I guess.
Yeah, and that's where we now talk about crews rather than teams.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So a crew, people are trained in role and role expectation. So you can see them in operating theaters and military environments. And I think there's a really interesting bit of work that we keep thinking about doing, which is to actually develop a crew structure for entrepreneurial companies. Which means the roles are defined, but you recruit people into the roles or people perform on the roles.
Yeah. We have a similar pod model. We call it a pod model, and it's 3 distinct roles that are collaborative in nature that serve clients in a very particular way, a more high service way, which is why we developed that pod model. And it's very valuable, but it does require a lot of accountability and care and oversight if people stay within their roles. Very valuable. So, Dave, thank you so much. We're out of time here, and this is, I know we could go way deeper. Some of this was pretty deep anyway. But what's the best place for somebody to go just to get an introduction to this, your thoughts on some of these things?
They come on to the website. So there are two areas there. One is my blog. So if the blog was made for me, that's where my new ideas are first evolved. All right.
Okay.
We run training courses and we have tools. So yeah,
okay.
they're all on the website.
Okay. Very cool.
If you want a really fast way of getting it, then there's the European Union Field Guide to Managing Complexity and Chaos.
Nice.
And that actually is a sort of simple summary of a lot of the methods and tools. So that's worth having a look at. Okay,
very cool. So we'll put those in the show notes for anybody that's interested. So, well, thank you again, Dave, for being with us on the Businessology Show. We really appreciate you doing all this and sharing your wisdom. So thanks again and take care.
Real pleasure.